Okay, now we're going to review the assignment that you just did about the executive branch and the qualifications for president and generally the president's role. The first thing that we're going to look at are qualifications to be president. You must be at least 35 years old, a natural born U.S. citizen. This means that you need to be born either in the United States or on U.S. territory. So that could be a military base. So, for example, when John McCain was running for president, he had been born on a military base, which makes him eligible to be president. There are other leaders of our country who were not born in the United States. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Terminator, who was the governor of California. He was born in Austria. So, though he can be governor of a large state, he cannot become president of the United States. And finally, you need to have lived in the United States for at least 4 years prior to becoming president. There are generally five main powers of the president: executive powers, legislative powers, military, diplomatic, and judicial. We'll go over each of these in order. In terms of executive powers, the president is the CEO, the chief executive officer of the country. And this means that he is in charge of executing or carrying out the law. So Congress will pass laws, and it's up to the president to give the details on what those actually mean and make sure that they are carried out and enforced correctly. He also has appointment power, so he can appoint people to the jobs that are necessary to carry out all of these laws and make sure that the government is functioning properly. He has ordinance power, which we're going to come to in another lesson in more detail, which is basically executive orders. He can, based on laws that Congress has already passed, write or sign an executive order that can do pretty dramatic things. And he has removal power, so he can remove from office most people that he has appointed. We'll talk a little bit more about that. In terms of his executive power, his executing the law, this is coming from Article 2, Section 1, in which the president is the chief executive of the country, and Article 2, Section 3, which you may recall, he shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And these brief phrases have come to give the president an immense amount of power in terms of what it means to carry out the laws of the country and to put his spin or his interpretation on what those laws are. So part of this is this ordinance power. And the president can issue so-called executive orders. These are rules or statements or regulations that the president will sign that have the effect of law. So the president will, for example, Abraham Lincoln, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves in the Confederate States, that was done by an executive order. So these can be big things or little things, and they have the force of law. One that was controversial recently was Obama's executive order protecting dreamers. So dreamers are young people who came over here with their parents illegally from other countries. And these are kids and young adults who basically have not known any other country except the United States. They can have lived here 10, 15, 20 years, gone to school in the United States, are trying to go to college, join the military, get jobs, and yet they are not legally here because their parents entered the country illegally, but for all other intents and purposes, they are as American as any other person in this country. And they're a very sympathetic group of immigrants, and most people agree that they should have a path to citizenship. But Congress during Obama's presidency and subsequently was not able to come together to agree on immigration reform legislation and a way to give these young people a path to citizenship. So, what President Obama did was to issue an executive order protecting all of these so called dreamers from deportation. Deportation is when you are sent back to the country that you came from. And it was felt that they didn't really have ties to those countries. The United States was the country that they'd grown up in, and he was basically saying, we are not going to deport these citizens, these people, and we're going to let them stay in the country. This was incredibly controversial because it was such a large group of people who were covered, and the president had made this decision on his own via an executive order. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Another controversial executive order was a travel ban that President Trump issued immediately upon becoming president, banning people from predominantly Muslim countries from coming into the US. Again, that was done by executive order. An executive order has the force of law, and there are only two ways generally that it can be undone. One is that another president comes in and reverses the executive order, or Congress can pass a law that directly goes against the executive order that the president had signed. Or the courts can declare a particular executive order unconstitutional, outside the bounds of presidential authority. But generally, as we see, courts defer or allow a lot of presidential authority. Presidents have appointing power, so the president can appoint top officials to his cabinet departments that we will learn about, in different departments and agencies, to carry out his agenda and to interpret the laws in the ways that the president wants them interpreted. He also appoints federal judges and Supreme Court judges, and those stay on for life or until they resign. And the appointment power is important because, as I've noted, it is a way for people who share the president's vision to take over the power of different departments and agencies and carry out that presidential vision. He can remove anyone from office whom he has appointed, except for the federal judges, the Article 3 judges, the Supreme Court judges, and federal judges. They can be impeached for not doing their jobs or unethical behavior, but the president cannot remove the federal judges. However, he can remove anybody else from office that he has appointed. The president also has very significant diplomatic powers. So the president is the face of our country abroad and with other countries. And he, with his Secretary of State and others, is empowered to make treaties with other countries, to make executive agreements, and to recognize other countries. And we'll go into what each of these actually means. But it is the president who represents our country around the world and who is the one setting our foreign policy and setting the nature of our relations with other countries. Treaties are formal agreements with other countries, and the thing about a treaty is that it must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. This is a very, very difficult thing to accomplish, and treaties take a long time to negotiate and get ratified. So instead, presidents often turn to what are called executive agreements. Now, executive agreements, we talked about executive orders and the Emancipation Proclamation and protecting the Dreamers and the travel ban. Those are for domestic issues. Executive agreements are basically executive orders in foreign policy. And these are agreements that the president can make with other countries and other leaders. They do not require two-thirds approval of the Senate. The president can and often does go to Congress and ask Congress to approve his executive agreements. An example is an agreement the president recently made with Mexico and Canada on free trade. And the reason that he does this is to get the buy-in and the approval of Congress on very important things. An executive agreement is not binding on the next president, unlike the executive order. Another important, and you might not think of this often, power that the president has is the power of recognition, the power to recognize, to give legitimacy to another country or another leader. And this can be very important. Often you will have groups in a given area competing for who is the real leader of the country, who is really in charge. And if the president recognizes, brings to the White House, says that one group or one person is the official leader of that country and that conflict, that can have tremendous impact on what's going on around the world. Recent examples that we've seen of this is in Venezuela, where we have recognized not the current president in power, but the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the official president of Venezuela. And it also has come into the headlines when President Trump was first elected and took a phone call from the head of Taiwan. Taiwan and China have been disagreeing over who actually represents the Chinese people. So there was another controversy over whether we would recognize the Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So U.S. recognition of leaders and places can be very powerful and very influential. The president is also the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, and he is the one ultimately who makes all military decisions. Now, we've seen that it's up to Congress to declare war, but it's the president who carries out the actual military operations. And as we'll talk in a further lesson, the U.S. has not formally declared war since World War II, but we obviously have been involved in conflict after conflict, loss of life, many, many times since then. So the president in this area as well, in terms of his military powers, has been gaining steady power in comparison to Congress, because presidents have used U.S. forces and troops in significant ways without the approval of Congress. This spurred Congress to pass what's called the War Powers Act of 1973 to try to assert their power in when the military is used and how it's used. But as we're going to discuss, that has had only limited effectiveness in terms of the president's power in military affairs versus Congress's. Congress obviously is the main body charged with making legislation, but the president does have some legislative powers. He can propose Congress take up a certain piece of legislation. He can recommend ideas to them. He gives a State of the Union every year where he sets out his priorities and urges Congress to act on what those are. But his main power here is the veto power. So if the Congress passes a piece of legislation which the president doesn't like, he can veto it. He can say no to it. And it takes a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress to overturn the president's veto. And that's a very difficult thing to do in a lot of situations. So the veto